Voluntourism. Voluntourism is commonly referred to as a similar experience to volunteer travel or a volunteer vacation, and many people find that doing meaningful volunteer work while also participating in tourism is a great way to get the best of both worlds. As a group, we have collectively agreed that voluntourism is a means for individuals to travel around the world and gain exposure to an array of different cultures. By getting to go on vacation, not only are these individuals volunteering, getting to go to a new country and volunteer for the community, but they are also getting to go on tours, go sightseeing, and relax at the beautiful country they are visiting. However, the vacation perk of voluntourism often acts as a distraction for volunteers and organizations. Volunteers and organizations are prone to getting too caught up in the vacation aspect and fail to be of service. Inevitably, the purpose of the mission is lost and put to a halt, as volunteers are unable to achieve a balance between being a volunteer and a tourist. So in other words, volunteerism is often an excuse for individuals to get a free vacation at the expense of those in need. Often, volunteerism-based organizations are unable to act on their promises to developing countries, and their positive intentions result in unintentional consequences for countries in need. This is primarily because organizations lack the credentials and regulations to properly run and execute these volunteer excursions, thus resulting in the inability for organizations to properly select individuals, train them, and make a positive impact on development. Which leaves us to question, is volunteerism beneficial to society? Is it good or is it bad? In order to address this question, we have compiled various pros and cons regarding the topic of volunteerism, which will in turn help us decipher whether or not volunteerism is beneficial to society. We will start off by talking about some of the current pros of volunteerism. We first thought volunteerism was a great way to help boost the economy within where the work is being done and help the community grow a lot more successfully and easily. By building infrastructure and developing systems in the communities, they can use the income from one new development to build others, like a domino effect, until the whole community is sustainable. When someone does one act of volunteer work, it typically leaves them feeling good, and so they want to participate in more similar activities. It also could persuade more people, such as your friends and family, to want to participate, as well as if you explain how much fun you had and how good you feel about the work you have done. Once you are there in a different country, speaking to people and making connections with all of them, it is a great way to build new relationships with the country, community, and other volunteers. Going on these trips, there is often not hotels and such to stay in, so some companies use host families that you stay with for the duration of your volunteer experience. By living in these homes, you get a true understanding of what it is like to live in these communities, and that can give you a much greater understanding of what you are doing there.
Voluntourism can be self-beneficial as it results in the participant feeling that they have helped someone in need of aid and may encourage them to keep participating in similar works. Going on volunteer trips can look very good on resumes. Time spent on trips can also be contributed towards volunteer hours and high school diploma, which could attract many participants. Many employers look for someone who participates outside of a work atmosphere. Volunteering is affiliated with positive characteristics. For someone to go to another country, being able to volunteer and help other people can help the individual reach self-actualization, the final stage in the hierarchy. This is important because it influences the individual to continue to be a better person and help support those in need of help, whether in their own community or around the world. Although there are a lot of pros to volunteerism, there's also many cons that have a significant and problematic impact on global development. Oftentimes, people go on trips to feel better for themselves, which does not do much good for the people who are in need of the help, as the volunteers are there for the wrong reasons. For example, some people go solely to finish their high school volunteer hours or to travel. This results in unproductive participation and may not help to progress development at all. When people look into going on volunteer trips, they don't see images of hard work and labor in the brochures. They see the scenery and the excursions that they go on. This entices them to go on the volunteer trip, but for them they see it as a vacation and not to help with development. This is another example of the wrong motives for participating in volunteerism. False advertising can go two ways. The brochures and advertisements for these companies can either over-exaggerate the positive effects of the trips and hide all the parts that require actual hard work, or they can over-exaggerate the negative and make the people from these countries look desperate and sickly to the point that we pity them and feel more inclined to help by going on the organization's planned trip. Companies looking for volunteers often take anyone who will pay the fee, and they don't do any screening for ability or willingness to work. Because of this, when the people arrive, they don't accomplish much, and most of what is done is unsustainable development. Some argue that the actual contribution to development is minimal and that the impacts on host communities are often assumed rather than researched. The lack of impact that the volunteer tourists have in host communities is often attributed to insufficient knowledge, inappropriate skills, or weak qualifications. To effectively help the community's development, and also leads to questions about the tourist motives for volunteering. When the country has to redo the work done because the people weren't properly trained and the buildings are not properly structured, it is costing the country more money and more resources, using funds that could and should be used on more developments elsewhere. The volunteer trips people go on do not last forever, and eventually people have to go home. But the children and people in these countries get very attached to the volunteers, and after they leave, it becomes very hard for the residents. With so many people coming in and out of the communities, it can be difficult on the residents. They get attached, which can be very damaging to the person's mental health, having so many people leave them. By sending people from the global north to help lift the south out of poverty, we are keeping these countries dependent on the north because we are not teaching them how to survive on their own. Almost always, people from the global north visit the global south. This could be seen as contemporary Orientalism. Maslow's hierarchy has 5 stages, in which you cannot reach any higher level without the ones below. People in developing countries often do not have the lowest basic needs like food, water, and safety. Critics argue that voluntourism is more about the self-fulfillment of Westerners than the needs of developing countries. In recent years, a disturbing form of slum tourism has taken off, with rich visitors sold a glimpse into the lives of the very poor. In Asia, unbelievably, tourists pay for trips to hand out food to impoverished rural families. In Africa, tour firms throw in a visit to orphanage alongside a few days on the beach or watching wild animals.
I went to the Dominican Republic over March break of grade 10 and built a water filtration system and planted mangroves which help prevent erosion, protect from storms, and filter pollutants from the water. This trip allowed me to implement sustainable changes into a village while I met many new people and saw a part of the world I would never normally see on a trip. However, my initial interest was to complete my high school volunteer hours, and reflecting, I was also very inexperienced in the work we were doing.
Of course, there are good and bad parts to volunteerism, but we as a group feel that for right now, the negatives outweigh the positives, and volunteerism has a negative impact on development. This is exemplified by volunteerism as a form of neocolonialism and a commodification of development. Stephen Waring's foundational study defines volunteer tourists as tourists who undertake holidays that might involve aiding or alleviating the material poverty of some groups in society, the restoration of certain environments, or research into aspects of society or environment. To conclude our research, tourism could be viewed as a new form of colonialism, as it is inherently members of the global north applying economic, political, and cultural influence on other countries. Voluntourism could also be defined by cultural imperialism, as it illustrates the imbalanced relationship between investing and receiving countries, the global north and the global south. Further, voluntourism could be seen as commodifying development as it is a form of moral consumption. Through funding volunteerism organizations, consumers are paying to help others. Stefano Point and Lisa Ann Richevi state that the development outcomes themselves, such as primary education for a child, vaccines provided to a health clinic or community, welfare, clean water, or commodities, sold as a means of achieving development for recipients and good feelings for consumers simultaneously. If the organizations are able to make alterations to their volunteerism approach, there is potential for sustainable development. A university is in many senses a better candidate to run volunteer programs than a simple travel agency. It is more likely to provide accountability, reflection, and learning outcomes. Universities would require a stricter selection process while still having a high demand for student participation. However, Western universities need to carefully use a volunteering language in international projects and distance themselves from a development aid discourse. Otherwise, they will potentially fall under the umbrella of neocolonialism, a critique that has been leveled against many other volunteer-oriented tour operators.